going on, folks? Welcome back to the channel here, or welcome if it's the first time you've stopped by. So, seeing as how we're still in the dead of winter and we're not planting anything outside anytime soon, I figured we should start making our prep work for next season. And we just finished selecting and buying our seeds, and it made me think about some of the main reasons that help us stay focused and select the right seeds for us. First up, let's talk about season length. This is one of the most important things when it comes to deciding what seeds you're going to plant in your space. If you've got really late last frosts at the end of the winter and really early last frost or first frosts come fall time, your season's going to be quite a bit shorter. Say something like mine up here in central Alberta. Our growing season really isn't that long. Our last frost date typically ends somewhere around late May, and our first frosts can be early as September. It's really important that we are selecting seeds that are actually going to mature in time and be ready to harvest before the snow flies. So we'll often look for early maturing or varieties that are able to withstand a little bit of cold tolerance. Typically, this still isn't going to be enough for most of our fruiting vegetables, things like peppers and tomatoes. And we're often starting those plants inside well before our last frost date of winter. Take these Anaheim peppers, for example. They list an average days to harvest of 70 to 90. Now, that doesn't stipulate whether that's from seed or whether that's from transplant. And in my experience, that number is never really that accurate. So for example, we find that we're not typically going to get actual peppers ready for harvest off the plant until we've had about 70 to 90 days outside. So that doesn't include the 8 to 12 weeks that we're going to grow these peppers in the basement under artificial light before transplanting them outdoors. Next, you want to think about your garden space and your layout. How much space are you actually working with? Are you growing in containers? Are you growing in planters? Are you growing in rows like we are here, or just raised garden beds in your backyard? This is all going to come into play with what you're able to grow and where. So some plants like room to spread out, say your cabbages and your squashes, whereas other plants are fine being closely packed together like your herbs or your lettuces. We have a unique solution here at First Crack Farm for garden planning. And it's not one that I've seen anywhere else before. And what we've done is we use Google Sheets to account for every linear foot of garden space we have outside. I won't dive into details here. I have another video entirely discussing that. I'll throw a link up in the top corner as well as one down in the description of this video. Admittedly, the video is a little boring, it's a little bit dry, but it will absolutely revolutionize how you plan your garden, and it's absolutely worth a watch. Ultimately, the key to spacing comes purely down to selecting seeds, or more appropriately, plants that are going to work in the allotment that you have. This way your crops or your plants can thrive without crowding on one another, and in no case is more ever better. Typically, spreading them out will actually increase your yield and lead to a happier, healthier plant. Up next, let's talk about how you actually plan to use your vegetables or use your crop once you harvest it. I don't think people actually think about why they're growing something. We often, and myself included, get so wrapped up in, buying new seeds and collecting things that excite us when we go to the store that we don't think about A, whether or not we have space for them, B, what we're going to do with them, or really C, whether it's in the budget to actually purchase more seeds. Ask yourself, are you growing for fresh eating? Are you looking to preserve? Are you looking for long-term storage? And these are really important questions because some varieties lead to better storage than others. Some are simply better for fresh eating than, say, pickling or fermenting. It's all about choosing the right variety for what you're looking to do with that particular crop. For example, we're growing a squash called Delicata. It's a winter squash, and one of the reasons we want to try it out this year is because it's really good for long-term storage. We grew another squash last year. It's somewhere in our container of seeds here, but it's called Turk's Turban. And we were actually able to store that particular squash throughout the entire winter season last year and ate it come spring of the next growing season. So some crops just store really well. On another hand, we love making salsa at the end of the season. So we'll often plant a whole ton of tomatoes purely dedicated for processing to salsa making. Take a minute to think about your family's needs, your family's plans, what you're looking to do with that before planning next year's garden. That being said, you can absolutely still grow stuff purely for the sake of curiosity and the fun of it. Hell, that's why we all love growing our food, or one of the reasons we all love growing our food in the first place. Point number 4 to consider is harvesting and yield. If you're planning to feed a big family, or maybe you want to even sell some of the produce you make or share it with the neighbors or donate some to the food bank, you might want to think about growing heavy bearing or high producing varieties of a particular species. It's simple math. The more you can produce from a single plant, the more you'll have overall. The other thing to consider is if you're growing in a constrained space, say a balcony or a patio, having fruit that is high producing or having plants that are high producing is simply going to give you more than a regular producing variety. We absolutely prioritized this in past garden years plans, where we were specifically choosing varieties that produced heavily and produced well in our previous space. This year is going to be a little bit different because we're dealing with a whole new ball game, way more space, and a completely different growing area. You know, we're 3.5 hours away. We're no longer in the city. It's going to be a different little microclimate out in our garden space. So we've gone a slightly different direction this year in that we're sort of throwing a whole bunch of different things at the wall to see what works. We're actually growing 51 different crops this year, or 51 different types, I should say. They're not all different crops. And just to see what works. And that way we can start whittling it down to what we like, what worked as we go forward in the next years. Finally, don't forget about personal preference. You're going to spend a whole ton of time with these plants, all the way from starting your seeds, raising your seedlings, maybe transplanting them out into the garden, and looking after them for months on end. It's far easier to stay motivated and stay consistent with working with your plants if it's something you're actually looking forward to eating in the end. So for example, this year, one of the things we're doing is we're doing a whole bunch of wild varieties of pumpkins. We've never had the space for pumpkins before, but I'm really excited to see how these are going to work here. We've got some that are specifically for eating, and we got some that are more dedicated towards pie making, and I'm curious to see how they're going to work on our property, but I'm really excited about it. I'm going to throw in one extra here as a bonus, and it's something that I just thought of, and I think it should be included in this discussion. And it comes down to disease and pest resistance. I know we all love growing heirloom varieties. It gives us that sort of connection to the past and how food used to be before everything was becoming modified or altered in some way. However, there are definitely times we're finding varieties that are either somewhat disease resistant or have pest resistance to them to be highly beneficial. For example, our old property had a lot of problems dealing with powdery mildew. And we ended up selecting some seeds, especially in the squash varieties, that were able to tolerate it a little better than others. And it made a big difference in our overall production come the end of the season. I don't know what we're going to face here, so I haven't thought about it too much this year. But if we wind up having a specific issue, it is definitely something we'll consider as we plan for next year's, or I guess next year's garden. Well, there you have it. 6 key things to think about when you're planning next year's layout, or things we're thinking about for next year's layout. First is our season length. How long do we have to grow? We're looking at our space and our layout constraints, if you have any. We're thinking about whether or not we want to use high yielding varieties in different types of plants. We're looking at what we're planning to use that food or that crop for, whether it's preserving or fresh eating. And we're absolutely considering our personal preferences. And then the last thing to consider when you're planning your layout is disease or pest resistance if it is something as a problem in your area. We don't know here yet, but we'll find out at the end of this first growing season. Thanks a ton for watching. If you find this stuff valuable, consider giving us a like and a subscribe, and click that little bell icon, and then you'll get notified when we release new videos. As always, thanks a ton for watching our videos. We appreciate every one of you and hanging out with me here at First Crack Farm. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks, folks.